In this episode, we talk about Proba-3, a mission by the European Space Agency which ISRO is a part of. We also talk about the Supreme Court's response to a PIL regarding electronic voting machines or EVMs. But first, we talk about a rather disappointing outcome of the COP29 conference, according to the developing countries. Hi, I am Niharika Nanda, and you are listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. As the 2024 UN Climate Change Conference COP29 in Azerbaijan's Baku comes to an end, the developing nations reel from a state of disappointment. Feeling that their demand for the mobilization of at least $1.3 trillion a year in climate finance was ignored, the developing countries had to settle for just $300 billion a year, that too from 2035. This year, delegates from about 200 countries gathered for the primary goal of COP29 to develop a shared plan for curbing global warming and to draw focus on scaling up climate finance to help developing nations tackle the adverse effects of climate change. In this segment, my colleague Flora Swain speaks to Indian Express's Amitabh Sinha, who shares his experience of the conference in Baku and dissects the agreements.
We spoke in the beginning when you were there at Baku covering the COP29, and from there up until now, after the summit has ended, there was this agreement between the developed countries and the developing countries where the developed countries have pledged $300 billion annually by 2023 for climate change. And this sort of has triggered strong reactions from India and developing countries. So if you can tell us in short, what is this agreement exactly and why is this agreement eliciting such strong disagreements?
Right. So we had discussed this earlier as well. This particular COP, this climate change conference, which happens every year, this was particularly focused on getting a finance agreement. And developed countries are under an obligation to provide money to the developing countries to help them fight climate change.
Correct.
So that's a legal obligation on the developed countries that they have to provide money to the developing countries. As of now, they have promised to raise $100 billion every year. From 2020 to 2025, they were raising $100 billion every year that they were providing to the developing countries.
Correct.
So the whole idea was to raise this money upwards. The 2015 Paris Agreement actually provides for this. The Paris Agreement says that before 2025, this amount of $100 billion needs to be raised upwards because now the expenses for meeting climate targets that has risen. So this amount is insufficient and therefore it needs to be scaled up. What that number should be, that is what was being negotiated at Baku. And the negotiated number now is $300 billion every year, not immediately, from 2035 onwards. Right. So as of now, developed countries will continue to raise, say, $100 billion, a little more than that, whatever they want, but it would reach a figure of $300 billion only in 2035.
Correct.
And there onwards, every year, at least that $300 billion target has to be met. So that's the main agreement. Now, of course, it's a disappointing figure, especially from the developing country perspective, mainly because they were asking for much more. They were demanding at least $1.3 trillion every year. The expectation was also that this figure would be met immediately and not in a distant future in 2035. But that hasn't happened. And that $1.3 trillion is actually coming from some needs assessment that has been done, exactly how much is needed. So that assessment was done in the last few years. And most of those assessments actually run into trillions of dollars. And based on those need assessments, the developing countries had been asking for at least $1.3 trillion. So that was the ask. And what was decided finally was $300 billion. So there's obviously a huge gap between the two. And it was not just about the amount only. There were a lot of other things about how that money would be raised, what sources would that money come from, in what manner would it be disbursed, so whether it would go as loans or grants or concessionary loans. So those kind of things were also to be decided here. Now, on all those counts, the demands of the developing countries were largely ignored. right? So not just the amount itself, but also how will it be raised, whether it would be publicly funded or privately funded, or would be in the form of investment or some other alternative sources. So the developing countries had a set of demands on each one of those things. And on most of it, it was largely ignored by the developed countries. And the final agreement that was pushed through at COP29 is largely what the developed countries finally agreed to.
But also, I want to understand, because India's negotiator, she not only said that, the amount is abysmally poor, but also the process with which, they circled on the 300 billion US dollars amount, that also felt sort of stage managed.
Yeah, that's the word she used, that it was stage managed. The reason being, there is a process that is followed before any decision is taken at COPs. It is countries are allowed to make a comment, raise an objection, or to say that they do not agree with it.
Yeah.
Right. So what happens is all the decisions at COPs are taken by consensus, which means even if one country, however so small that country might be, if that country stands up and says, I do not agree, then the agreement is not done. So one by one, the different decisions are taken up for approval. The president of the conference announces that we are now going to take up this matter. And after the announcement, he sees whether any country has anything to say about it. And if there is no objection, or if no one has anything to say about it, then it is put to vote and it is considered that everyone agrees with it because nobody has any objection. Nobody has raised any objection. So for every other decision, this is the process that was followed. And when this particular one came up, so the president actually read out that this is the matter we are going to take up next. And even before anyone could raise their hands or sought an intervention, the president said, seeing no objections, it is approved.
So they basically didn't give time.
They didn't just give time, but it was almost like forcing the agreement through. Now, to be sure, this is not the first time that such a thing has happened. In fact, it has happened at several other places also. But yes, India had serious objections to it. And India made a very strong statement, criticizing the process that was followed. There were some other countries also which supported India's stand, Bolivia, Nigeria, and there were a couple of other countries also which supported India's stand and said, yes, the manner in which it was pushed through was not right. So India's objections were mainly twofold. One, over the process itself, the fact that countries should have been allowed to raise objections or to have their say before it was passed. Particularly so since the Indian negotiator made it very clear that the presidency had been informed about India trying to make an intervention, and still it was overlooked. So one was on the process that was followed, and the other one was about the content of the agreement itself, that $300 billion is not sufficient.
How do you think that now that, there is a sort of a bone of contention between developed countries and developing countries, how do you think it's going to affect the future of the COP?
So this is nothing new, actually. The climate negotiations actually divides the country into developed and developing. And the negotiations at every climate conference and all the climate conversations, it's always divided on these lines. So the developed countries on the one side are developing, and you have like smaller groups of countries with specific demands. So countries are organized around their interests. So there is a group called the least developed countries group. There is a group of countries, small island states. So they are grouped together. The African countries are grouped together. There are developing countries, like-minded developing countries, they call themselves. They are grouped together. There is the basic group of countries, Brazil, India, China, South Africa. They take common negotiating positions, but they're all on the developing country side. Similarly, you have on the developed country sides, you have certain groupings as well. But mostly, most of the issues have very deep divisions between developed and developing countries. So it's not something new. It's actually built in the structure of the negotiations itself. So this is not a new threat. I mean, this is how negotiations have been held over the years, and this will continue in future negotiations as well.
Absolutely. Amitabh, if you had to cite 3 takeaways from the 11-day summit that you just attended, the 2-week summit, what would your key 3 takeaways would be?
So the final agreement, and there are several other agreements as well, but as we have discussed earlier, finance was the main thing here. So the main outcome on FINACIS, which is this $300 billion a year figure, that's underwhelming. It's a disappointing figure. It's not something that the developing countries would be happy with at all. See, this money was meant to increase the ambition of climate action, isn't it? So every kind of climate action that countries are taking that requires certain amount of money. And the argument for the developing countries was, if you give us more money, which you are under an obligation to provide, then we will be able to take higher actions or more ambitious climate actions. So the fallout of this relatively meager sum of money would be that now that next year countries have to submit their next round of climate action plans, and one clear fallout would be probably countries would not be very ambitious in their climate action plans. So they would just probably do the bare minimum that is required of them. The other key takeaway is the agreement on carbon markets. Again, we won't be able to get into the details, but carbon markets is a mechanism wherein countries or other entities are able to trade carbon credits with the overall objective of, incentivizing the mitigation objectives. So now carbon markets actually provides monetary incentives to make emissions reductions. And the hope is that, this kind of a setup, it used to exist earlier also, but Paris Agreement is now trying to set up a new carbon market mechanism, that this kind of setup would actually accelerate mitigations. So what this particular conference did was, there were some rules and modalities that remained to be finalized, and those were finalized here. So which means now carbon markets is ready to get operationalized. The third thing, which has largely been drowned in the finance negotiations, is it can probably be described as a little bit of backsliding on the mitigation targets. So if you remember what happened last year in the Dubai conference, for the first time ever, there was a reference that was included in the final outcome, a reference to transitioning away from fossil fuels, which means that there was an agreement, an acknowledged agreement that fossil fuels need to be phased out for a period of time and renewables brought in or replaced with renewables. Now that's a process that's already on for several years. It's a process that is getting accelerated year by year, but there is no mention of it in the COP decisions. For the first time last year, the mention of fossil fuels was brought in a COP outcome, and that was considered, a significant outcome from Dubai. What has happened this year is they were discussing that part, how to take that decision forward. And in this year's outcome, fossil fuel has not been mentioned because some countries were strongly against it, notably Saudi Arabia and its partner countries. They did not want another sort of a decision on fossil fuels, and that was kept out. So some people would see that as sort of backsliding from what happened last year. But those are details. It doesn't affect the process that we are already seeing, in the sense that, more and more renewables are getting deployed in place of fossil fuels, at least in the developed world, at least in the large developing countries like India or China. That process is already on and it's gaining momentum every year.
Next, we talk about the Proba-3 mission. The Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO, is all set to support the European Space Agency in the launch of their Proba-3 mission. ISRO will be launching the Proba-3 mission on its PSLV rocket from Sriharikota on 4th December 2024. This mission will study the solar corona, the outermost and hottest part of the sun's atmosphere, and will also attempt a precision formation flying, the first of its kind. To understand what kind of significance ISRO holds in this mission and how the mission will be implemented, we have Indian Express's Anjali Marar joining us. Anjali, can you tell us about the Proba-3 mission?
Proba-3 is the latest solar mission which the European Space Agency, or ESA, has developed, and the Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO, is all set to launch it on December 4th. It is one of the most complex solar missions so far attempted by any country, which is why it is also unique. It has 3 instruments on board, and it is basically going to study some of the lesser studied areas of the sun, making it one of the most advanced missions that will be launched. So the teams participating in Proba-3 include scientists from Spain, Belgium, Poland, Italy, and Switzerland. And there have been industrial partners also from other European countries. The three onboard instruments, of which the coronagraph is the primary instrument, is known as the Association of Spacecraft for polarimetric and imaging investigation of corona and the sun. This is the most important instrument on board. Apart from the coronagraph, there are two other instruments known as the Digital Absolute Radiometer, or DARA, which will measure the solar irradiance. And the final instrument is a 3D energetic electron spectrometer, which will measure the electron fluxes as it passes through the Earth's radiation belts.
Right. And what is the aim of this mission as far as studying the sun is concerned?
Sure. So essentially, sun is the star which controls the space weather, and having knowledge about sun, how it behaves, how there are solar storms, solar emissions, which emanating from the sun affects the space weather. All of this is very important to understand space weather. So Proba-3 will essentially study the solar corona, which is the outer atmosphere of the sun and one of the hottest regions which needs to be studied. It is also one of the most difficult regions to study because obviously sun being the hottest star and the temperature it is, there have been not many attempts successful to study the sun. So Proba-3 will be another addition which will help to study the sun's corona. And why it is important to study the corona is also, as I was mentioning, the space weather is controlled by certain factors like solar storms, solar winds, which originate from the corona. So space weather is important also for us on Earth because any variation or perturbation in the space weather can directly affect us on Earth. And how is that? All our satellite-based communication, navigation, power grids, all of these are potential threats if there's any disturbance in the solar weather or there's any powerful solar emission coming headed towards the Earth. So imagine not living with a satellite-based communication in today's time and era. So knowing the space weather, attempting to predict space weather, all this are very key for even our living on the Earth. And that can be done only when we know how the sun behaves and how its corona is behaving through the solar cycle, which is why Proba-3 will be an important mission.
Right. But what makes the Proba-3 mission stand out as far as other space missions or missions towards studying the sun are concerned?
As mentioned before, it is one of the most advanced and technological demonstration which the European Space Agency is attempting. What is unique is that there are two satellites, the occulter and the coronagraph, which will be launched simultaneously. But through its journey, a little into its journey, these two satellites will separate, but not separate entirely, but they will come into a special flying formation or a flight formation for a purpose. So just an analogy, we have seen the Indian aircraft make special formations during the 26th January Republic Day parades. They are all well coordinated. They form certain shapes. So similarly, these two satellites, the occulter and the coronagraph, will always be in tandem, will always fly in tandem, and this will be done automatically. There is no human intervention in this flight formation. And why is this being done? It is basically to create an artificial solar eclipse. So in order to study the solar corona, the best possible avenue is the natural solar eclipse, wherein the moon passes between sun and earth, and for a momentary period, the moon casts its shadow on the earth and we're able to see the beautiful rim of the sun. But that is just lasting for a few minutes. That is not sufficient for the solar physicists to study. It is impossible to send a probe close to the sun or look directly into the sun. Just like human eyes, even instruments cannot look at the sun. Though the occulter and the spacecraft satellites will always be facing the sun side, so essentially what the occulter and coronagraph will do are that the occulter will block the sun's fiery face and create a shadow, and coronagraph, which will be positioned 150 meters in this shadow region, will then do the observations. So one can imagine that these two satellites have to position one another in such a manner that there is a stable shadow available for observations. And this will be done for a period of 6 hours, whenever it is orbiting. So this is a very high precision demanding flight setup or flying formation which will be required, and it has never been attempted before by any other mission. This is why Proba will be one of the unique missions to study the sun so far.
Right. And Anjali, why would you say was ISRO particularly chosen for helping out the European Space Agency in the launch of the Proba-3 mission?
So ISRO has previously also launched missions for other countries, and Proba-3 will be the latest one. Two reasons. One is the cost, and second, importantly, being the desired location where Proba-3 has to be launched into. So Proba-3 is going to be launched into a highly elliptical orbit, and the geographical condition which ISRO's launchpad facilitates is the best suited for its launch, which is why then ISRO happens to be the launching agency for Proba-3.
Right. And will India be at the receiving end of certain benefits as far as this mission is concerned?
For India, the Proba-3 being launched by ISRO is one of the another milestone or another demonstration of India's space-based capabilities. We have seen the success of Chandrayaan or Chandrayaan-3 precisely. So this is just another reckoning to India's space capabilities and abilities. And as I said, this is a very complex mission having 2 satellites going to be launched into a highly elliptical orbit. In addition to that, if the listeners can recall, not very long ago, that is last September, India had launched its maiden solar mission called the Aditya L1. And in January this year, it had reached its desired location, which is the Lagrange point 1 or L1. So there are attempts being made between India and the European Space Agency solar physicists to collaborate and see if Aditya L1 and Proba-3 data that get generated can somehow be collaborated and used for further advancement of science. So maybe that's another big advantage which India will have. Some Indians have contributed with their Belgium counterparts in Proba-3, not directly, but in some other capacities. But if this is made possible between Aditya L1 and Proba-3, there will be direct access to the data which Proba-3 will generate over its mission life of 2 years.
And in the end, we talk about a PIL regarding electronic voting machines. Yesterday, the Supreme Court dismissed a PIL that sought the reintroduction of ballot papers in place of electronic voting machines or EVMs, remarking that the machines are blamed only when one loses an election. Justice Vikram Nath, presiding over a 2-judge bench while dismissing the PIL by evangelist K.A. Paul, said, quote, "What happens is, if you win the elections, EVMs are not tampered with. When you lose elections, EVMs are tampered with. When Chandrababu Naidu lost, he said the EVMs can be tampered with. Now this time Jagan Mohan Reddy lost, he said EVMs can be tampered with." Unquote. The comments came as Paul, arguing in person, cited tweets by Naidu from 2018 and some recent posts on X by Reddy, alleging the possibility of EVM tampering following their defeat in the elections. Paul introduced himself to the bench, also comprising Justice P.B. Varale as president of Global Peace Initiative, an NGO based in the US, and claimed to have rescued 310,000 orphans and 40 lakh widows. He said that he had just returned from the Global Peace Summit in Los Angeles and his PIL had the support of about 180 retired IAS or IPS officers and judges. To a query from Justice Nath as to why he wanted to get into politics, Paul said his plea was not political but to protect democracy. He added that he had been to 155 countries and they all followed the ballot paper system. Paul claimed that he had been in the humanitarian field for 43 years as an advisor to prime ministers and presidents of the world. He said, quote, "Even the last 6 chief ministers and prime ministers here, including the present prime minister, have attended my summit." Unquote, adding that 18 political parties have supported his prayer for physical ballots. Justice Nath asked him why he did not want India to follow a different approach from the rest of the world. Paul responded by saying that it was due to corruption in elections. Buttressing his argument, the petitioner said that Election Commission itself had disclosed recently that it had seized Rs 9,000 crore. The petitioner also referred to Elon Musk's statement that EVMs can be tampered with. The bench, however, was not moved and went to dismiss the PIL. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by me, Niharika Nanda. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.